Howdy friends, Brian Flechsig of Mad River Outfitters, and welcome to yet another one of our fly tying tutorials. Today I'm going to walk you through the world famous Pheasant Tail Nymph. Now, Pheasant Tail Nymph is another one of those flies that you're probably going to want to learn to tie, especially if you're a trout angler, and boy, it can really be an effective fly almost anywhere in the world. Been one of my favorites over the years, and also it's a pretty easy fly to tie. So today we're going to be using a 2x long nymph hook. A nymph hook is typically a little heavier, more durable for bouncing along the stream bottom. And 2x is what we really prefer for most of the nymphs, general mayfly type nymphs that a pheasant tail represents. And then really we only have three other materials. First and foremost, the pheasant tail itself, peacock herl, one of the most widely used materials, and then a little bit of copper wire. Just I use the brassy size of copper wire, and that's it. The thread I'm going to be using is black 70 denier ultra thread. If you're using a different brand, you might go with something like 6/0 thread, but I like this ultra thread from Wapsi in the 70 denier. And really pretty simple. You're going to, of course, insert your hook in the vise. Today I'm using a size 12. So that you can see it, and of course a size 12 is a good all-around size for a lot of your different mayflies. And then I'm going to start my thread. Well, first thing I got to do, get my cheaters on there. Now I can see what I'm doing. I start my thread middle of the hook shank or so, as I do with every fly that I ever tie, and wrap my thread back to the bend of the hook, let it hang, and cut the excess. And then I'm going to attach a tail. If a fly has a tail, it's almost always going to be your first step, and I kind of view it as a preliminary step. But I'm going to take this pheasant tail feather, and you're going to find that the center tails are typically the best. The center tail will have even barring and even consistency on each side of the feather. And I'm going to grab the scientific amount of a bunch. But if you had to know, it's probably somewhere about the width of the hook gap. And if you remember from a previous tutorial, the gap of the hook is the distance between the barb and the shank. And I want to grab a bunch of pheasant tail fibers that's probably about the width of the gap of the hook. You can use that kind of as a general rule. And I'm going to trim those off the stem of the feather. Now, I might try to even up the tips of those a little bit, but I'm not going to go crazy over it. And then I'm going to have the tips of the pheasant tail feather pinched between my thumb and my index finger in my right hand, and I'm going to measure it. And as with most flies, I want the tail to be approximately the same length as the hook shank. So I keep adjusting it by switching hands, pinch, pinch, until I get the approximate right amount of pheasant tail tips sticking out between the thumb and index finger. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch hands. I'm going to marry my thumb and index finger of my left hand to the thumb and index finger of my right hand. Now the proper length of pheasant tail fiber for my tail is pinched between my thumb and my index finger. I'm going to cradle them right on top of the hook shank, and I'm going to do my pinch method. Pinch, pinch, and pull straight down. Pinch, pinch, and pull straight down. And if you do that right, your pheasant tail fibers should sit right on top of the hook shank. Just to go back and review, if you don't use the pinch method and you just start to wrap, you'll see that I'm going to push those pheasant tail fibers around, and it's going to be a mess. So that pinch method is critical in applying materials so that they stay in place right on top of the hook shank. So I pinch, pinch by pulling straight down, and boom, my pheasant tail is right on top of the hook shank. Now I'll go ahead and wrap over those butts. And again, this is a technique that I like to do all over the place albeit can be a little bit wasteful, but that by wrapping over that, first of all, it adds security so my tail is not going to pull out, and then secondarily, it keeps the diameter of that hook shank uniform for when I wrap other materials over top. And then I'll trim that excess. Now I'm going to grab another bunch of pheasant, actually first I'm going to tie in a strand of copper wire. And I'll go about something like 4 inches, something like that. Nothing critical. And this stuff's so thin I don't have to worry about it being too bulky. All I'm going to do is lash that to the hook shank. No reason to do the pinch method there because it's easy to grab onto, it doesn't twist around. And then secondarily, I'm going to use this copper wire to wrap around and give a rib to the fly, adding that look of segmentation. So I'm not worried about that being right on top of the hook shank. Now I'm going to grab my second bunch of pheasant tail fibers, and I'll probably grab a little bit more, maybe another quarter more or almost double of the bunch that I grabbed before. Grab it by the tips, and now I'm going to tie this bunch in by the tips right there at the bend of the hook. And I make sure to wrap over the tips to secure it, and then I'm going to wrap back to the bend of the hook so that I make sure when I start to wrap the body, which I'm going to do with this bunch, that I start right there at the bend. Okay? So now I'm kind of done with that process. I've got the tail, I've got my copper wire, which I'm going to use as a rib, and then I've got my second bunch of pheasant tail fibers tied in, all extending off as if they were a tail right now. So I bring my thread forward, and I'm going to bring it forward to just past the halfway point. And if you're not sure about this, especially if you're just getting started in fly tying, one of the big problems with beginners is proportion. And we can't say enough about proportion when it comes to fly tying. So I'll kind of measure with my hook points just to be sure, and I brought my thread forward just a little past the halfway point. I might want to go back just a turn or two. And now I'm going to go ahead and wrap the abdomen of this pheasant tail nymph. And the first thing I'm going to do is grab that bunch of pheasant tail fibers, and I'm going to start spiraling it forward. Now you want to kind of massage it a little bit, and then as I go around, I'm going to use my index finger to keep it in place, to keep it from kind of spiraling out or accordioning out on me. And you want a semblance of taper. This is why we tie this material in by the tips. We want a semblance of taper, and since you started at the tips and it's getting fatter as you go up, but I can also kind of double up on wraps or overlap the wraps a little bit to help me with that. But just like with in Mother Nature, that nymph is going to be slimmer at the rear end and get fatter as it goes up. So I've done that by twisting this bunch of pheasant tail fibers around. And then once I get to my thread, I'm going to switch hands. I've now got those butts tight, keeping them tight. Remember, you always wrap under tension. Okay, you don't want anything loose on a fly. And I hold them at about a 45 or a 60 degree angle, and then I'm going to use my non-bobbin hand, or in this case my left hand, to put 2 or 3 security wraps to tie that in place. And then I'm going to come and trim the excess. Okay? Now I can, in this case, since I'm going to be putting stuff over top of that, I can wrap over those butts just for even added security. Okay? Now I'm going to take my copper wire, and I'm going to use this. The copper wire on this fly does several things. First of all, it adds to the segmented look, like the abdomen on a mayfly nymph is segmented. So it's going to give us that impression of segmentation. The copper wire is also going to add a little bit of color and a little bit of flash. And thirdly, it's going to add durability. This pheasant tail is pretty delicate stuff, and if it's bouncing along the rocks along the stream bottom, and or you catch a fish or two and their teeth kind of scrape on it a little bit, that pheasant tail can certainly get damaged and come unraveled. And this is something kind of unique. Usually I would wrap away from myself. That's one of the basic rules of fly tying is that you're always wrapping away from yourself. Well, we wrap that pheasant tail away from ourselves. So now for added durability, I'm gonna break one of the cardinal rules of fly tying, and I'm gonna wrap towards myself. And what this does is allows the spirals of that copper wire, and if we can get in close enough, you'll see that I'm just kind of spiraling it, and it's going crossways to the pheasant tail, adding even extra durability to the abdomen of this fly. Now, there's no set number of wraps, although when you do rib a fly like this, just like when you put palm or hackle up a fly, you want those wraps to be fairly evenly spaced. Just a sign of a well-tied fly if they're fairly evenly spaced, and you want the angle of those wraps to be kind of similar. And then once I reach to where my thread is, once again, I'm going to throw that over 2 or 3 times, making sure that I grab it really well there with my thread so it doesn't come unraveled. And once I feel good about it, I can come in and trim it close. So there's the first half of the fly. We've tied in the tail and we've tied in the abdomen. Now we're going to do the thorax region of that nymph, which is going to contain the legs, it's going to contain kind of the meat of the body, and it's going to contain the one wing case that all mayflies have. So once again, guess what? We're using pheasant tail, and we're going to once again grab the scientific amount of a bunch, probably about the same amount as I used for the body, okay? And we're going to tie this in right where our thread is hanging at approximately the halfway point, okay? But kind of a cool trick here, and I see some people do this, some don't, but I'm going to go ahead and show it to you here. You can decide whether or not you want to do it. But you want this wing case to be about half of the hook shank or so. And then I'm also going to double. We're going to fold this over, and these tips that are here are going to become the legs of this fly. I'm going to show you a really neat trick. So measuring this, when I hold it, and remember I'm holding it right where my thread is hanging at about the midpoint of the hook shank. What I'm going to do is I'm going to measure this such that when I hold it there at the midpoint of the hook shank, the tips extend back just a pinch further than the tail. There we are again, the scientific amount of a pinch further than the tail extends. So if you can see when I lay it in there, it's just a little bit longer than the tail. Once I've got it measured properly, I'm going to switch hands and I'm going to pinch, pull straight down, pinch method, pull straight down, and it should be right on top of the hook shank. Once it's secured in place, I can go ahead and wrap over it, making sure you don't get too close to the eye of the fly. You've heard me say that before, that you don't want to crowd the eye of any fly. All I'm doing is securing it, and then I wrapped my thread back to the bend of the hook. You can really kind of think of tying this fly, as you can with a lot of nymphs, in 2 stages. You start at the bend of the hook to create the abdomen, and then I'm going to start at approximately the midpoint of the hook shank to create the thorax. So it's almost like tying 2 separate flies. Once I've got it secured, I'm going to come in and trim it close with my scissors. And then you'll see I'm going to fold it over and create the thorax. Now I can see right here by doing this is a cool thing to do, is fold it over and check your proportion. I'm not happy with that. That's not going to be a big enough, a fat enough thorax for my taste, which hopefully for the fish. So all I have to do at this point is wrap my thread backwards a little bit. So I wrap my thread backwards towards the bend of the hook, and now fold it over, and it's going to give me a better idea of how long that thorax will be. I actually want to go a couple wraps back. There we go. That's going to look better. Now, peacock curl, one of the most popular fly tying materials of all time. You'll see me use peacock curl in a lot of different patterns. I love the stuff, and the reason why I love it is fish love it too. It has an iridescence and a sheen that's really not duplicated anywhere else in Mother Nature. And we're going to use peacock curl to build our thorax on this fly. And I just grabbed a bunch. This is strung peacock curl. It's cheap, available in any fly shop, or of course madriveroutfitters.com. And I just grabbed a bunch of them, maybe about 5 or 6 strands. That's not the best looking strand right there. I'll pull him out. And then you'll see on the peacock curl, you get this kind of cuticly looking stuff where the feathers were attached to the bird or to the quill. And I'm going to cut those off. Just makes it easier to work with. And then you really don't have to do any measuring here. I'm going to lay it in because you're going to wrap it just like you do with chenille or any other materials. And then, of course, I'm going to wrap my thread back to that midpoint or where the wing case starts so that I make sure as I start to wrap this material, I'm covering all that area. And once you've done that, you've got your wing case and what's going to become your legs tied in, and I just tied in a whole hunk of peacock curl. I got one little peacock curl I don't like. He was a little short, and he's not going to make the grade. He's out of there. Okay, so I grabbed that, and it might help you to kind of twist the peacock curl a little bit. Helps to kind of marry them together. And all I do is start to wrap around the hook shank. Here's another guy I don't like. Get him out of there. And I'm simply going to take that whole bunch and start to wrap it forward. Now, I'm not exactly going one turn in front of the other necessarily. I'm just trying to fill this space and make a nice, fat, meaty thorax to this fly. Okay? I'm feeling pretty good about that. Once I've reached where my thread is hanging, which should be just slightly behind the eye, leaving myself enough room to tie off these materials and form a head on this fly, I'm going to, again, take my thread and throw it over that hunk of peacock curl 2 or 3 times until it's secure. Then I can come in and trim that excess, trim it close. And now I just created the thorax of that fly. And then your last steps are going to be really pretty simple. I'm going to take this big clump of pheasant tail fibers, and I'm going to fold it over, creating the wing case. Okay? So I simply grab it with my right hand, fold it over, kind of cradle my thumb and index finger right behind the eye, and then I'm going to use my left hand to throw this over, making sure that I get those to seat right on top of the hook shank. Okay? And now I've got this excess pheasant tail tip sticking out. Well, we're going to take my scissor points. I'm going to divide that into 2 equal bunches. Now check this out. I'm going to grab one bunch with my left hand, try to get them as even as possible. One bunch with my left hand, pull them down the side of the fly. One bunch with my right hand and pull it down that side of the fly. Now here's kind of the tricky part, is you want to then, boom, just grab those tips with your left hand, thumb and index finger of your left hand, and stroke them down the side of the hook shank. You can kind of do that a couple times and they'll start to behave for you. And I want them canted downward ever so slightly. You don't want them canted upwards. And I just kind of lay them back, and then I'll take my thread and wrap over them. And what you're going to see that's going to do is it's going to lay those legs back. And I killed 2 birds with 1 stone. By using that clump of pheasant tail, I created the wing case, and I created legs which lay along the side just perfectly. Might be a pinch long on my legs there, but I don't mind that. I don't think the fish do. The more movement, the better. You'll certainly hear through these tutorials how much I like soft tackled flies, so the movement there of those legs. I like a nymph to be big, meaty. You gotta feed them a pretty good meal. I want this to look like a Big Mac, not like a Happy Meal. So Once I've got those legs in place, I can just make sure that I form an even, well-tapered head on that fly, okay, which I pretty much have. I don't need to add too much to that. I'll grab my half-hitch tool, 2 wraps around, slide it over the eye of the fly, easily, gently, hold it in place. I'll do another one. Pull on to secure it, and then I'm going to cut my thread. For added security, if you wanted to take, of course, a drop of head cement and put it right on your thread, it's going to add some durability. And also, a lot of times, I'll take a little bit of head cement and coat that pheasant tail wing case, and you might even run a little strip down the back. Just adds quite a bit of durability to that fly. But there it is, your basic pheasant tail nymph. Couldn't be easier. So thanks for joining us, and stay tuned for more. And be sure to check out our fly tying blog at Mad River Outfitters for recipes on these flies and many more. Thanks for joining us.